Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the various news items we have for you this week, an update on the progress, let's call it, of the measles outbreak in the USA. We have injecting gold into your eyes to help with vision preservation, perhaps one of the most expensive means of keeping your eyes intact. An argument that brown rice is not good for you due to the presence of arsenic. Bacteria that can't live in isolation, and as such could be one of the earliest examples of multicellular life. The fiasco around DOGE and the various claims that it was or was not responsible for various data breaches. Curiosity has found evidence of the carbon cycle on Mars, and various other news items that you can find in the timestamps given below. Let's start with what RFKrrayKray has claimed is a not unusual phenomena, that is, the outbreak of measles. This claim is utter and complete bullshit. Let's start with the simple numbers here. There are 800 confirmed cases at present across 24 states. Now, that's a small increase in relative terms of about 10% from last week, so that's not ideal. The difference is, though, that when RFKrrayKray says not unusual, we need to take that with an exceptional amount of salt. The first reason is this. By comparison to the same time in 2024, there were only 245 cases or thereabouts. So we're already roughly 3 and a bit times higher in terms of the number of cases. But okay, that's last year. What about if we look at the average over the last few years? And yeah, you'll find that there is a certain pattern over the years where you see a slight surge and then it drops when people go, this was a dumb idea. And then you see a gradual return to that surge. But even if, and this is the big if here, you were to take all of the previous year's data and you were to try and compare it, only one year has had a higher number, and that was 2019. And considering 2019 was a complete year, and we're roughly a third of the way through 2025, well, the numbers don't stack up all that well so far. So if, and this is the big if here, you were to assume that we're going to see the same sort of results come at the end of 2025 compared to 2019, where they had 1,274 cases, we could arguably expect to see somewhere like 2,400 or more cases. And that's a rather terrifying figure. That is significantly unusual, despite RFKrrayKray's claims otherwise. Next we move on to, arguably even more alarming news, simply because ancient diseases are becoming antibiotic resistance. Yeah. This is all about typhoid. And typhoid is something that, if you're in a developing country, you're aware of. If you're in a developed country, say America, the UK, most of Europe, Australia, Canada, various other places, you don't have to worry about because you get treated for this with a prophylactic vaccine early in life, and you may occasionally need to get a booster, especially if traveling, but nonetheless, it's not likely to be something you particularly care about. The problem is, the bacteria that you get that vaccine for are becoming increasingly resistant to treatment for it when you get infected. That's a worry because, as mentioned, there are parts of the world where typhoid is a significant concern, and if that resistance develops there, and it gets somehow into other countries, you're in for a really shitty time. I mean that both literally and figuratively. Typhoid does involve copious amounts of diarrhea. So yeah, this is not a good place to be in. Now understand, antibiotics are the only way to treat typhoid. Specifically, it's Salmonella typhi, but let's just stick with typhoid to make life easier for everybody. One of the big problems is mostly in, let's say, Asia Minor, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, where, unfortunately, due to population issues, distribution, and so on and so forth, there are all sorts of problems around getting vaccines out and getting antibiotics to people in a way they can be used long-term enough to get rid of the condition entirely. So that's a rather bad place to start with, but things do get worse, because, at least when it comes to bacteria, things can always get worse, or in other terms, slightly more shitty. What you're going to struggle with here is that the most recent generation of antibiotics that are widely used now account for 85% of all resistances, which means the current antibiotics that are available to use basically are running out, which, yeah. And of course, it is spreading. Now, spreading largely here to Africa and around Asia, but also there have been cases, very clear cases, found in other countries, let's say more developed countries or areas like Europe, North America, and so on. So it's not like this is just a localized issue. This will arguably become a global concern, and we definitely don't want to be going back to the days where typhoid was not just common, but a big enough concern where we basically had the first epidemiologist ever learn about how things spread. Shifting on to ophthalmology news, we have injecting gold into your eyes. Now, this sounds like a stupid gimmick, much like, say, gold leaf in vodka, but this does arguably have a little more to go for it. It's still incredibly preliminary, but still, there is something to be said for it. Sadly, this is not exactly the typical kind of retaining your eyesight, or for example, getting a new prescription for your glasses or contact lenses. No, this is very specifically targeted at age-related macular degeneration, which is something that affects the retina, and within that, the light-receptive photoreceptors within your eye. Basically, once they start wearing out, you kind of gradually lose your eyesight. Now, you can slow it down, but you can't really stop it. Importantly, it cannot be stopped with current treatments. But they do believe that using gold might, theoretically, be able to do so. This is really a creative approach, but let's actually look at what's going on here. We can start with the idea that they're taking nanoparticles made out of gold, and what they're intending to do is attach these to antibodies. What the antibodies do, along with the gold, is essentially act as a way to protect the eye, and therefore encourage it, in some respects, to be easily targeted by lasers, because lasers make everything better. In this case, by targeting the retina that's being tagged with the gold and antibodies, you're able to excite the receptors and therefore, theoretically, prevent them from atrophying, in a manner of speaking. Just be mindful that this has only been demonstrated in a rodent model. Shifting to other waste products of the human body, we have arguably one of the more weird examples, menstrual blood. Yeah, it's the idea of using this for medical research. Strictly speaking, and technically speaking, it is both a biological hazard and a waste product, and strictly speaking, has no further use in the human body. But it does contain a wide variety of things that could be useful in research. You have the rather obvious candidates of things like the blood itself, with red blood cells and similar, but you also have various antibodies, you have leukocytes, you have lipids, you have fats, which are technically a form of lipid, you have proteins, you have all sorts of things along with certain cells. The challenge will simply be, how do you take this essentially cocktail of waste products and differentiate them enough to figure out what is useful and what isn't? You could, at least in theory, start by simply going, well, we've got what is effectively endometriosis, just where it's meant to be, and work from there, but it does seem like this is a very long stretch to claim that what is, for all intents and purposes, a biological hazard is indeed useful for more than just, well, telling you that you aren't pregnant this month. There is a sort of argument made, let's call it, that through, say, cell cytometry or similar, you could take out stem cell samples from the menstrual blood, and this could be used to, for example, differentiate into other kinds of tissues or cell types, or in useful ways, say, to better predict what happens with miscarriages that occur repeatedly. So there are, arguably, ways it could be done, but then you do have to ask the very obvious question of, well, multiple questions in fact. First of all, when you make the presumably going to be a donation, is it donated in the same way, say, Henrietta Lacks' tissue cancer biopsy was? 2, can you actually extrapolate out the results from one individual who's donated theirs to anyone else? And 3, even if you can, how widely could you do so? Shifting to news that's slightly more universal, although generally speaking, mostly in those who are more health conscious, it's claims that brown rice contains more arsenic than white rice, and therefore it's actually not dangerous. Yeah, this is actually a mixed message. Not necessarily unreasonably so, but definitely a mixed message. What it comes down to is how much arsenic is actually present, and is there an actually dangerous dose in there. And we don't mean dangerous as in it will kill you, we mean will you just be mildly unwell all the way through to death. In this case, it's basically you have no real risk of anything. And the reason for this is that the arsenic is largely contained within the bran. And so, when you remove this to make white rice, you obviously remove the arsenic concentration, and basically all of the content. Therefore, the brown rice has it, but nowhere near enough to actually be a problem. But, for those who are, for whatever reason, particularly, let's say, sensitive to arsenic, for whatever reason, it's something to be particularly mindful of. The, let's call it, downside to foregoing brown rice in favor of white rice is that brown rice has significantly more fiber, and that fiber is going to provide you with much greater and more immediate benefits. For example, not being constipated, than any vague, metaphysical, and possibly distant future problems associated with such a tiny amount of arsenic that it's basically a nothing burger. Although, then again, if you were to be very creative, you could find ways to be particularly nefarious with your rice. Shifting to environmental news now, we have animals, and what we specifically want to draw your attention to is another animal, and specifically a nocturnal animal, that basically glows in the dark. In this case, we're talking about owls, and that their wings have a pink glow that is intended, in part, to send a message both to other owls and partly to its prey. The prey, of course, being, "I'm here, you better hide." The owl is called the long-eared owl, also called the Asiotis, and, well, it's named pretty much because of how it looks. The look it carries is also sitting there saying, "I'm hunting, leave me alone," or alternatively, "This is my territory, go away," unlike most similar signals which are basically "sex me," just louder and generally more vibrant. For example, sports cars. Going now to microbiology news, we have very early evidence for complex life on Earth. It's essentially a bacteria that by itself simply can't survive. In combination, it can. Now, this has been found relatively weird place. It's been found in the sulfide-laden sediments of tidal salt marshes in Massachusetts. So, yeah, we're not talking about something that's across the world. Where it gets, let's call it, interesting is, as we mentioned, the fact that each individual cell in a colony, so to say, cannot live without being within the larger colony, let's call it. And this is the important thing. The colony is actually called a consortium, but let's just stick with colony to make it easier for everybody. The cells in question basically straddle the line between having two genetically distinct and separate organisms and having one, much like, say, the human body, which, whilst genetically the same, has different roles to play. And this is where it gets very interesting. It's, in many respects, comparable to the blastocyst, that is, the stage in embryonic development for a human, shortly after you have egg and sperm merging together. Unlike a blastocyst, each of the cells in this colony, let's call it, have their own particular roles to play, and they do have their own distinct genetics. But as mentioned, because each of them only has a limited degree of functionality, for example, like your lungs, the result is fairly straightforward. If you were to take your lungs out of your body, they die fairly quickly. And not just because, well, you as a whole organism would die, but because they lack, say, blood flow. They don't have the ability to absorb nutrition and so on. Conversely, you could apply the same thing to any other organ. So it's not like the lungs are special in that respect. In the same way, if you were to take one of these cells out of and put them in isolation, you would find they cannot survive as they do not have the full suite of required abilities. Shifting now to news that's a little more immediate and certainly more political and topical, we have Harvard possibly being in trouble for having committed sanctions violations. Given the other things Harvard's in trouble for at the moment and possibly having to fight in court, this is not going to help them. The article by Ozak Stonefish goes through the various details to understand why it is that Harvard's in trouble, and for the most part it comes down to simply They were involved with supporting the groups in Xinjiang that have been persecuting Uyghurs and possibly, if not definitely, committing genocide. Which, well, it's Harvard, they're not exactly well known for their, let's say, political, or more accurately, apolitical stance, and their lack of endowment, but, well, this is not going to help them. In similar news that should apply the same lesson, that is, don't take it necessarily at face value, we have the DOGE debacle and the fact that a whistleblower claimed that, well, the DOGE was basically being exposed to vulnerabilities, particularly from Russia, because Elon Musk is bad. The news is not all that new. Let's be clear about this. It really does go back to early to mid-April anyway, and over a course of about 3 days, investigations were done, and what they found is that the whistleblower basically made everything up. What's important here is not so much the exact example, so much as it is an example of people not jumping to a conclusion based on nearly nothing, in this case a single whistleblower claiming various things. Why it's important is not necessarily just because Elon Musk various political bullshit. No, it's that any news item, something that you should apply to even our videos, is something where you can take it at its face value and go, okay, that's true, or you can be not necessarily skeptical, but critical of it. That's one thing we repeatedly say with a lot of the research we've mentioned so far. Yeah, it could work out, but don't take it as it is, and definitely use liberal amounts of salt. Where this particularly becomes relevant is, well, the initial whistleblower claims were based purely on hypothetical and, in many cases, a gut instinct-based hunches around possible breaches of security, which is really not a good basis for anything to be done. In a happier news, although strictly speaking it's not actually happy news, it just looks that way, we're going to have a lunar event that looks like a smiley face. Yeah, it's one of those weird things where we see a pattern that doesn't really exist. It's not quite a Jesus on a cheese sandwich, but it's a pretty good attempt. What you're going to be looking at is Venus and Saturn sitting just above the moon, but the moon is really going to look like it's fallen on its side. And of course, being a waxing moon, well, it's not there yet. So we have essentially a moon crescent, which looks fancy and looks like a smiley face, which is cool in theory, but it doesn't really mean all that much, other than getting some cool photo opportunities. Next we shift significantly further into space and go all the way to Mars, where on the surface of Mars in the Eyegold crater, Curiosity has found evidence of a carbon cycle on Mars. Now, this doesn't seem like it's all that exciting at first glance. After all, the carbon gets cycled in all kinds of ways, but the importance of this one is rather more important, as what it talks about, or at least suggests, is that there's a habitability that we could have considered with Mars that previously wasn't the case. And to simplify, what they've found is that in order to have liquid water on Mars, Mars had to be warm enough for, well, water to be liquidized, but not so warm as to turn to a gas state. Right now, most of it's basically solid because it's just too cold. In order to get to just the right temperature, volcanoes had to be active and putting CO2 into the atmosphere, thereby providing an atmosphere to start with, but retaining heat, which is the key thing there. And their evidence indicates that at some point, Mars was actually just such an environment. Well, more specifically, just such an environment based on the evidence in terms of the chemistry and mineralogy. So, yes, Mars may have previously been habitable, but certainly not anymore at the moment. If you were to, let's say, try to live on Mars outside of your spacesuit, your blood would immediately boil out of your body, causing you to basically explode. And for most people, that's not their idea of fun. The final news item we have for you is still on Mars, but now delving well below its surface, and quite literally into its core. The core of the issue is why it is that Mars has no magnetic field to speak of at the moment. And is this really why it basically has no atmosphere to speak of? The evidence is growing, let's say, that at some point Mars did have a good magnetic field, mostly because of that previous article, but a bunch of other research too. So what's happened to Mars on a larger scale but specifically within its core that has led to what's happening. The, let's say, proposed answer has two parts to it. First of all, the researchers believe that Mars's inner core was completely fluid, unlike Earth's, which is a solid core surrounded by liquid. Because of this difference, they believe that the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere of Mars would have had significantly different levels of heat escaping and therefore different levels of magnetic field. The second part to this is somewhat more important. Because you have a very different movement of the energy involved in creating that giant magnetic field, they believe, and this is very important to note, that in order to be able to make Mars habitable again, to some extent, we'd have to get the entire core to be liquidized, but also importantly, that the very fluid dynamics of Mars would have had an effect on its crust, and because of this, you basically have a huge planetary problem in the planet being habitable, which, in short terms, doesn't really mean much to us now, but if humanity is looking for other planets that could theoretically be habitable, this is a significant variable that we would need to account for. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.